feeling a little overwhelmed. Like there's just too much information out there and not enough time. I get it. That's why we're here. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take complex topics and break them down, giving you all the key insights you need in an easily digestible format.
And today, we're diving into a particularly chilling topic, the land of Barovia. A listener sent in some really captivating audio for us to analyze, specifically from episode 7 of Admiral Blackbeard's Curse of Strahd into the Mists series on YouTube. It's titled, Welcome to Barovia.
Right, and what we've got is essentially a front row seat to a role-playing game session. In this episode, our group of adventurers has just made their escape from a pretty unsettling location called Durst Manor. How did that encounter go for them?
Well, the players themselves actually commented that they thought the fight inside Durst Manor was surprisingly straightforward. One player specifically mentioned that the character Raven and her smart use of her abilities was a key factor in their success.
So good tactics win the day. Always a good lesson. But it sounds like there was a lot more happening behind the scenes than they realized.
You got it. After the session, the game master actually revealed a hidden mechanic that the players weren't aware of. There were several large braziers inside the manor. During each round of combat, these braziers had the potential to flare up and summon additional cultists into the fight.
Oh, wow.
The players, totally focused on the immediate threats, didn't realize that by destroying these braziers, they could have prevented those reinforcements from coming.
So a potentially much harder encounter, inadvertently made easier. I guess sometimes what you don't know can actually work in your favor. And one of the players actually had a feeling of familiarity with this particular encounter. What was that about?
Yes, one player mentioned recognizing elements of the encounter. Sort of implied that the DM had pulled some things in from something that this player was a fan of.
Ah, very cool. A nice little nod. Now, this death house that they mentioned, what's the deal with that? It sounds like a pretty infamous location.
Yeah, so the Death House is a really common introductory adventure for the Curse of Strahd module. So for those who don't know, that's the module that this game is using. And the Death House itself is known for being super deadly, even leading to what's known as a TPK.
A TPK? What's a TPK?
Oh, total party kill, meaning all the player characters dying during the encounter.
Oh, yikes. Okay.
Yeah, the Death House is infamous for this because it's filled with all sorts of booby traps and tons of monsters, and that's even before they go into the dungeon level below the house, which is even more dangerous.
Sounds like our adventures got off a little easy.
Yeah.
Definitely made for a more enjoyable start to their Barovian experience. Now, we also heard about some changes in the makeup of the group. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So 2 players, Arctic and Song, they actually had to leave the group because of some scheduling conflicts in the real world. And in the session before this one, their characters were written out of the ongoing story.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah, it's pretty common actually with these longer campaigns. Real life has a way of interrupting.
Right, always, even in Barovia. So, after escaping Durst Manor, and with a slightly smaller group, what awaited them outside? Any welcoming committees or anything like that?
Not quite. They actually discovered what they thought was a gift basket left for them by Count Strahd himself. It contained a bottle of wine, 20 gold pieces to split between them, and 4 healing potions.
Not bad, actually. But knowing Strahd, I'd be eyeing that wine very carefully. What did the note say?
Well, the note welcomed them to his domain and offered a rather sarcastic thanks for dealing with the vermin and the House of Death stain, clearly talking about Durst Manor. It also offered them a place to rest, though without giving any specific directions.
Oh, so cryptic. And just a tiny bit condescending, calling us vermin. Classic Strahd. So no clear instructions. Where did they decide to head to?
They decided to keep going west. It was the direction they were traveling in before the whole Durst Manor detour. Seemed like the most logical next step, especially since going back the way they came was explicitly mentioned as a bad idea.
Yeah, stick to the plan. Makes sense. But then things got a little mysterious. They found something unexpected in their path.
Yes. As they were traveling, they came across a single black feather just lying on the road, and right next to it was a rolled-up parchment note.
Okay, a black feather. Already seems ominous. What did the note say?
Well, the note was written as a rhyme, and it directed them to seek out a specific person in the tavern in the nearby town. The person was described as being near the falls, possessing strange cards, having a worn face, bitter and scorned, and wearing red clothing with sky-colored eyes. And it also stressed that they had limited time to find this person.
That's a pretty detailed description, almost theatrical. How did they react to this mysterious message?
Their reactions were mixed. Some were skeptical about trusting a note that basically just fell out of the sky. Others were more pragmatic, figuring they didn't have any better leads at the moment. And one player even made a bit of a, well, let's say a stereotypical joke about it being a little gypsy woman, which gives you some insight into their initial assumptions.
A little bit of unconscious bias. Fair enough. But reservations aside, they decided to follow this new lead. However, it turns out they weren't alone on the road. They ran into some of the locals.
That's right. They were stopped by two pairs of Barovian scouts armed with crossbows. These scouts were searching for a missing girl named Gertruda. They described her as being around 19 or 20 years old, with brown hair and a slender build. She had been missing for about 3 nights.
Oh, that's not good. Missing person in such a creepy and isolated place, definitely concerning. What did our adventurers tell these scouts?
They told them that they hadn't seen anyone alive during their travels, and they described their encounter at the old manor, emphasizing that it was ruined and that they didn't see anyone matching the description.
Okay.
They also mentioned that they'd buried some companions there, which, plays into the whole thing about the two players leaving.
Right. So, being somewhat cooperative, but not entirely forthcoming, what did they learn from these scouts about the local situation?
Well, the scouts revealed that their main duty was to protect the village of Barovia from all sorts of threats that roam the surrounding lands. There was also a bit of back and forth where one of the adventurers mentioned the frequent wolf packs in the area, something they had already seen for themselves.
Wolves, always a problem. Did they ask about this person from the note, the older woman at the tavern?
Yeah, they asked if they knew of any older woman who frequented the local bar, someone who might fit that description. But the scouts said that mostly men go to the tavern, sometimes couples. No one really stood out as an older woman.
So that lead might be a dead end, or maybe their mysterious guide isn't what they were expecting. Speaking of, what about the Vistani? The note did mention someone near the falls, which is often associated with the Vistani, right?
Yeah, the adventurers specifically asked about Vistani. The scouts said that there was indeed a clan of Vistani camped out near the falls west of the village, which seemed to line up with the direction mentioned in the note.
Interesting. So ultimately, where did they decide to go?
Well, even with the uncertainty about the older woman, they decided to head towards the village of Barovia, specifically to the tavern called the Blood on the Vine. They figured, given the time limit in the note, the tavern was the most likely place to find their mysterious contact.
A little bit of warmth and maybe some answers. Sounds like a plan. So they finally arrive at the village. What were their first impressions? Was it the welcoming sight they were hoping for?
Not exactly. The landscape had changed quite a bit. As they approached the village, they found themselves in this misty and oppressive valley. The crops were failing, the livestock looked thin and sickly, and even the fences were rotting and falling apart, and looming in the distance was the silhouette of a dark and twisted castle.
Okay. Sounds more like a nightmare than a welcome. What about the village itself? Any signs of, community, life, defenses?
Well, the village was surrounded by a crude defensive perimeter, a jagged trench with wooden stakes driven into it, and some hastily built barricades. Near the village entrance, they made a pretty gruesome discovery. A charred pyre mound of burned bodies. The smell of burnt flesh and decay hung heavy in the air.
Oh, that's awful. A pyre of burned bodies. Could they tell anything about how this happened?
Based on the level of, charring and decomposition, it was estimated to have happened within the last couple of days. One of the adventurers, Zikran, he has abilities that allow him to get information from remnants of the past. So he touched the pyre,
Okay.
and he experienced a very chaotic vision of a battle. He saw villagers, packs of wolves, and shambling, decayed humanoid corpses, some of which were disturbingly large and monstrous.
Undead attacking the village.
Yeah.
Seems like those scouts weren't kidding about the dangers.
Yeah.
And it sounds like Zikran decided not to fully share what he saw.
Yeah, he downplayed the details, maybe choosing to keep some of that disturbing knowledge to himself for now.
Right. So they finally entered the village, passing by this pretty grim scene. What did they see as they walked through?
The village was a picture of utter desolation. Many houses were broken down, windows were shattered or boarded up, and some of those boarded up windows had a stark red X painted on them.
Oh, those X's sound ominous.
There was also an abandoned palisade project just left unfinished, which added to the sense of despair. It felt like a heavy dread hung in the air. They did have a couple of fleeting encounters. A black cat darted through the shadows at one point, and they heard the very faint sound of sobbing coming from somewhere in the mist.
Even the little hints of life, the cat, the crying, just makes it feel more depressing. But there was one sign of potential refuge.
Right, as they got closer to the center of the village, they started to smell food cooking and could hear the murmur of voices. They were getting close to their destination, the Blood on the Vine Tavern.
Ah, finally. Food and maybe some information. What did the tavern look like from the outside?
It looked a little run down. The roof was sagging. The sign above the entrance read, "The Blood on the Vine," which, is a bit of a change from the more common, "The Blood of the Vine." And as they approached, a raven landed on the sign for a moment before flying off.
Hmm. Interesting detail with the sign on instead of. Do you think that was deliberate? Could it mean something?
I think it's worth noting, definitely. It could be a hint at some change that's happened in Barovia, maybe with the tavern itself or something more widespread, we'll have to see.
Okay, so they finally go inside. What was the atmosphere like? Cozy and welcoming.
Not quite. The second they walked in, the entire room went silent. Everyone stopped what they were doing and stared at them. The barkeep, who looked kind of short and bored, just kept polishing glasses, seemingly unfazed.
Not the warmest welcome. Who were some of the people they noticed?
There was a tall man with messy, dirty blonde hair, wearing a kind of worn but still nice coat. He was sitting alone, nursing a glass of wine and looking grim. There were also two rough-looking guys at another table, hunched over their mugs, also not looking too friendly.
Definitely feels like a place where strangers aren't exactly welcomed with open arms. Did they manage to get the barkeep's attention?
Oh, yeah. They went up to the bar and ordered some food and drink. Beet soup, wolf stew, something called famous pie, and some roasted roots.
Yeah.
They also noticed that the price of wine seemed to have gone up.
Even in Barovia, inflation is hitting hard. So before they could even dig into their meal, they were approached by one of the patrons.
Right. The tall, grim man from the corner came over to their table. He introduced himself as Ismark Endurovich before offering to pay for their food and drinks.
How did the other patrons react to that?
One of the gruff guys, Bildrath, reacted pretty badly. He actually spat into his mug and called Ismark the Lesser.
And he warned the adventurers not to listen to Ismark, basically saying he'd lead them to ruin. Ismark got tense but forced a smile for the newcomers.
That's a strong reaction, almost like Bildrath knows something we don't. Or maybe he just really hates Ismark. Either way, not a good sign. So Ismark then explained his story to the newcomers.
He did. He told them about the recent attack on the village by Strahd's forces and how his father, the burgomaster, had been killed. He also said that many villagers had fled to a town called Valaki.
Oh, no.
And he confirmed that the scouts were looking for this missing girl, Gertruda. Oh, and another family was missing too, he said.
A deadly attack and multiple missing people. Doesn't sound good at all. When did this attack happen?
He said it was about a week ago, and that it ended just 2 days before they arrived, the same day his father died.
And what triggered this attack? Why would Strahd, the lord of this land, do such a thing? Well, Ismark said that about 90 days ago, a group of people tried to attack Strahd while he was in a sort of slumber or hibernation. Apparently, he'd been in that state for the last few years.
So they woke the sleeping vampire. Not a great move. And they confirmed Strahd is definitely a vampire, right? Not just some evil ruler.
Oh, yeah. Ismark was very clear about that. He said Strahd is the ancient count of the land, a vampire who has ruled for something like 600 years. He also said that everyone in Barovia is trapped. There's a magical mist that Strahd controls, and anyone who tries to leave gets exhausted or even dies. It's been like that for centuries.
Wow, 600 years of this. I can't even imagine. So what did Strahd do when these people tried to attack him? Did he immediately retaliate?
Not quite. He sent his chamberlain, someone named Rahadin, to the village with a 90-day warning. Told them to make peace with their gods. The attack only came after that warning period ended.
So, calculated and cruel. What about those red X's on the doors? Did he explain those?
He did. He said they mark the houses where people have gotten sick. Apparently there's some kind of illness going around since the fighting stopped, and some of those who get sick, well, they end up coming back as undead. Those houses are boarded up to try and stop the spread.
That's terrifying. Not only an undead attack, but now a mysterious plague. Did Ismark know anything about the missing people or the illness?
He said there wasn't any clear pattern to either. He did mention that the village gets its water from a well in the center of town, behind a place called Bildrath's Mercantiles. Could be something to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely worth noting. So why was Ismark telling all of this to these strangers? He was looking for their help, right?
Exactly. He needed help with two things: taking his father's body from their mansion to the cemetery for a proper burial, and getting his sister, Irina, to the safety of the Church of St. Admiral in Valaki. He thought the church, being on hallowed ground, might offer some protection from Strahd, who, according to Ismark, had taken a particular interest in Irina.
Hmm. I wonder if that's the whole story. Is he being completely truthful? Could there be more to it?
You always have to wonder in a place like Barovia. Trust is hard to come by.
Right. So Ismark is putting a lot of hope on these newcomers. He even invited them to stay at his mansion.
He did.
What did they say to all of this? Were they ready to jump into action?
Well, they said they'd think about it, but they really needed to rest first, understandably. They'd been through a lot and they had a long journey. They said they'd talk more in the morning. One of them did say they'd rather stay at the mansion with Ismark than in the creepy tavern.
Makes sense. A slightly less hostile environment would be nice. And our friend Bill Draff, did he have anything else to say as they were leaving?
He sure did. He slammed his mug down and shouted bullshit.
Really?
Yeah, seems like he really doesn't believe Ismark.
Okay, that's not encouraging. And with that, they left the tavern with Ismark. So after this initial deep dive, what have we learned?
Well, we've gotten a glimpse of the very real dangers facing these adventurers. They've stepped into a land ruled by a 600-year-old vampire who isn't afraid to use his power. There's been a recent attack, people are missing, and there's this strange illness going around. And right away, they're asked to help this guy, Ismark, who seems pretty desperate.
It's all very bleak. Strahd isn't just some spooky legend. He's a tangible threat. People are dying, turning into undead, disappearing. And this guy, Ismark, even with all the skepticism surrounding him, is putting all his hope in these strangers.
It really makes you wonder, what would you do in their shoes? Would you trust Ismark?
Yeah. Would you risk facing Strahd? Would you try to help Ismark, or would you try to figure out what's really going on in this place?
There are a lot of unanswered questions.
And it feels like we've only just scratched the surface. This is just the beginning.
Indeed.
So that brings us to the end of this deep dive for today. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. Keep those questions coming. Keep thinking. And we'll see you next time.